Hi everyone, welcome to the visual guide for the Deltascape version 3.0 Savage. If you've made it this far, you're totally ready for playtime with Halicarnassus. This video assumes you have a basic understanding of the mechanics on normal mode and will instead focus on the changes to Savage difficulty. My name is MINDJACK and I'll be your raid guide. Tanks and healers will need to watch for critical hit throughout the encounter. As the name implies, this is an extremely high damage critical hit on the main tank, and the use of heavy cooldowns and awareness is key. SPELLBLADE Holy will mark up players in a specific manner. 2 players will be affected by these circle Holy edge markers and tethered together. 1 player will be affected by the stack up Holy blur marker and tethered to another player affected by a circle Holy edge marker. The remaining 4 players will have no markers. The boss will then cast Pole Shift. This will cause any tethered players to be stunned for a short while and swap positions and markers with their tethered partners. Immediately after, the effects of Holy Edge and Holy Blur will go off on the respective players. To handle this, we have the 2 tethered players with Holy Edge move away from the group. Where they move doesn't really matter as long as they're not overlapping with any other players. Then, the Holy Edge player tethered to the stack up Holy Blur player will stay on the boss, stacked together with the players without markers, while the stack up player moves away. Once Pole Shift goes off, the stack up Holy Blur marker will be swapped onto the boss where everyone is already stacked together and waiting, while the Holy Edge marker is moved safely out of the group. The 2 tethered Holy Edge markers will swap positions as well, but since they're off on their own already, there's no danger in overlapping damage. The Queen's Waltz is next. On these neutral tiles, this ability shoots out high damage blades at each player. There is no telegraph, and players will need to assign positions around the boss to ensure they are not overlapping. You'll need to be ready to use this positioning throughout the encounter, so learn your spot relative to the boss and stick to it. Haste will grant the boss a 6-second haste buff. This is usually followed by one of 3 possible elemental spells. SPELLBLADE Thunder 3 is a long column attack on a random player. SPELLBLADE Fire 3 is a large donut-shaped AoE, and SPELLBLADE Blizzard 3 is the point-blank AoE circle attack. Players will need to be ready to avoid all of these attacks as they occur throughout the encounter. Dimensional Wave is a heavy-hitting raid-wide AoE. Healers will need to shield and heal through this as necessary. The playing field will create 6 new tiles on the ground with roll markers on them. The boss will then cast Oink. To avoid getting turned into a pig, players need to stack together with at least 1 other person. If you do get turned into a pig, you won't be able to stand in the proper tile and you will die. After stacking for Oink, players can move into their appropriate tiles before she casts the game. Next up comes the first panel swap. The tiles will change to flower and briar tiles in one of 2 orientations. Briar tiles will slow and deal damage to you and should be avoided. The briar tiles will only form in 2 opposite corners, creating a diagonal flower section to work with throughout this phase. During this panel phase, the Queen's Waltz will apply Thorny Vine tethers on all players. If you don't break your thorns quickly, they will begin to apply stacking vulnerability up debuffs and deal high damage. The tanks and healers will be tethered to damage dealers, and as such, you can easily assign a direction for each group of players to run to, allowing you to quickly and easily break your thorns. For example, our tanks and healers run towards the safe corner in the north, while our damage dealers run towards the safe corner in the south. As soon as the Thorny Vines apply, the boss will also cast SPELLBLADE Fire 3. However, since each player is already moving to the opposite corners to break their vines, this should be naturally and easily avoided. Next up is another haste buff and a SPELLBLADE Thunder 3. Avoid this as necessary. The second critical hit on the main tank is next. Cool down and heal through this as necessary. Heal through the next dimensional wave and then get ready for the first place token. In this phase, place token will spawn a white flame ad that should be picked up by the off tank and moved away from the boss as soon as possible. This ad does a fair amount of damage to its primary target, so healers and off tank beware. Periodically, the ad will cast White Wind in a very large circle around it. Should this hit the boss, it will heal her for a ridiculous amount and essentially ensure a wipe to the enraged timer. To avoid this, we pull the boss towards the safe corner in the north, while the ad is taken towards the south and focus down as quickly as possible. The main tank will have to deal with another haste buff and a SPELLBLADE Blizzard 3 during this time. Dodge it as necessary. Next up, MINDJACK will place a specific directional debuff on each player in the group that lasts 13 seconds. Once the duration of the debuff ends, each player will be forced to march in the direction specified by their MINDJACK debuff. While this timer is counting down, the boss will jump back to the center and begin to cast another Queen's Waltz and SPELLBLADE Fire 3 combo. This will coincide with the end of each player's debuff timer, so all players will need to position themselves in such a way as to be forced cast by MINDJACK into the direction of their assigned corners to break their thorns and dodge the fire 3 as necessary. An easy and visual way to ensure proper positioning is to point the arrow of your debuff marker in the direction of your safe corner. Healers will need to heal through another dimensional wave, and then the next panel swap occurs. This panel swap will bring up the familiar blue and black tiles. Place token will spawn a great dragon that should be picked up by the off tank and destroyed as soon as possible. Make sure to keep it facing away from the raid to avoid cleaving everyone with frost breath. In this panel phase, the Queen's Waltz will do raid-wide damage and cause the black tiles to explode, dealing high damage and debuffing anyone in them. To avoid this, all players will need to position themselves on top of the blue tiles. Immediately after, she'll turn to a random player and cast Ribbit. This is a huge frontal cone, and players will need to quickly move behind her to avoid it. Getting frogged here is fairly detrimental, as it lasts much longer on Savage mode. Healers will need to handle another dimensional wave and another critical hit on the main tank. Tanks, don't forget to use your cooldowns. Next up, Place Dark token will spawn a number of Soul Reaper adds around the outer edge of the platform and one in the center, right on top of the boss. The adds on the outer edge will cast Gusting Gouge and rush across the platform in a straight line, rendering any tiles they're facing unsafe, while the add in the middle will cast a large point-blank circle AoE. At the same time, the boss will cast the Queen's Waltz. The timing of all of these mechanics at once allows for only one blue tile being a safe zone. Players will need to quickly determine which of the 4 blue tiles aren't being rushed by any of the Soul Reapers, and move into that safe zone before the cast goes off. Getting hit by any of the outer adds will knock back, do high damage, and place a vulnerability up and damage down debuff on you. Immediately after, the boss will cast Haste and another of the 3 Spellblade AoE attacks. Dodge this as appropriate. Another dimensional wave to heal through, and the panels will swap once more. In this library phase, you'll notice 4 glowing book tiles in the north and the south, and 8 empty tiles in the middle. Standing in a glowing book tile will consume the glowing book and give the player a specific vulnerability down buff. This will be used for a mechanic later on, and players should be careful to avoid consuming these books until that time. In this panel phase, the Queen's Waltz will call down folio books on any tile occupied by a player. These books are exactly the size of a tile and deal a high amount of damage. Should players overlap their books, they will die. To handle this, all players will need to stand in their very own tile during the Queen's Waltz. To facilitate this, we assign one of the 8 tiles to each player and spread out appropriately in anticipation of this attack. Healers will also need to heal through the folio damage as quickly as possible. Next up, another Oink cast. Players will need to immediately stack together to avoid getting pigged. The next place token will spawn a weird looking panda. The off tank will need to pick this up immediately while everyone else destroys him as fast as possible. This add can deal a fair amount of extra damage on your off tank, and destroying him quickly can take some of the stress off of your healers. The add will cast Magic Hammer, which will spawn massive AoE circles under every player. This happens at the same time that the boss begins to cast another Queen's Waltz. Since there is very little room to work with in your 8 tiles, we have players bait these Magic Hammer circles in specific areas to create enough room to dodge the AoE while still staying in their respective tiles for the Queen's Waltz. Each melee player will stand in the center corners of their tiles in an attempt to stack their Magic Hammer circles as closely to the middle as possible. The ranged and healers will bait their Magic Hammer circles as close to the outer corners as possible. This should allow each player enough space to dodge the AoE circles, but still remain within their respective tiles. Even when done correctly, there is a lot of ray damage going out, so healers be ready. Immediately after, the boss will cast Squelch. This is a gaze attack that will turn anyone it hits into an imp. Players will need to avoid this by turning away from the boss. Another dimensional wave to heal through, and another critical hit on the tank. Shield, heal, and use cooldowns as necessary. One more dimensional wave to heal through again, and then players need to prepare for Spellblade Holy. In this phase, Spellblade Holy will mark up 2 players with stack up Holy Blur markers, 4 players with the red circle Holy Edge markers, and 2 players with nothing. This is where the glowing books come in. Since obviously there aren't enough free players to share the damage of the 2 stack up attacks, we need some buffs to help us out. The glowing blue books with the floating diamond pattern will apply a magic vulnerability up buff for 8 seconds to the first person that touches one, while the glowing green books with the floating shield pattern applies a physical vulnerability up buff. Both types of glowing books will also apply out-of-action debuffs on players for 8 seconds, meaning players will be unable to perform any actions during this time. To handle all of this, the players with the red holy edge circle markers will each grab a green book and then hang out until all the attacks go off. The stack up holy blur marker players and the players with no markers will each get a blue book and then pair up to share the damage of each holy blur attack. The difficulty here comes in the fact that the boss is also casting Queen's Waltz during this time, and each player needs to make sure they're alone on their own tile to avoid folio overlap. The stack up holy blur pairs will need to be very careful to each stand on their own tiles, while at the same time close enough to be considered stacked enough to share the damage. There is again a ton of raid damage going out at this time, and remember that healers will be out of action for a few seconds after all of these attacks go out. You'll need to top everyone off as quickly as possible since the boss will cast another dimensional wave directly after. Next up comes the final panel swap. You'll notice that this floor has tiles from each phase you've seen so far. This is where it gets interesting. The boss will begin by casting the playing field. This will spawn 2 frog tiles, 2 imp tiles, and 2 pig tiles. Immediately after, the boss will cast the 3 abilities that can turn players into these 3 forms. Once all 3 attacks are out, she'll cast the game, and all the animal tiles must be filled appropriately by at least 1 player each, or you will probably wipe. Furthermore, if you're standing on the wrong tile, you will die. To handle this, we assign specific players to transform at specific times. To maximize DPS uptime, you can have the healers get transformed by the first cast, the tanks transformed by the second cast, and the damage dealers transformed by the final cast. Since the order of each form cast can vary, each group will need to be ready to handle each cast in turn. Being in one animal form does not make you immune to any other transformations, so be careful not to mess yourself up, or you can use it to your advantage if you do mess up early. Once all 3 attacks go off, players can move to their respective tiles in preparation for the game cast. Next up, the boss will jump to a specific tile and cast the Queen's Waltz. Depending on which tile she's standing on, the Queen's Waltz will have its respective effect. If she's on a book tile, make sure you're all alone in your assigned tile. If she's on a briar tile, stack together in the center and then move to your respective corners to break your vines as quickly as possible. If she's on the blue tile, make sure you are also on a blue tile to avoid the tile explosions. If she's on a neutral tile, spread around her in your assigned positions to avoid overlapping that saber damage. Since this can vary every time, players need to be extra vigilant in watching her movement and being ready to react appropriately. I'd also recommend repositioning the boss as close to the center whenever possible during this phase to facilitate pre-positioning for each Queen's Waltz variation. Next up, another Spellblade Holy and Pole Shift combo. This is the same as the first combo and is handled in the same manner. The red Holy Edge circle pairs will move away, while the lone Holy Edge player stacks on the boss with the free players, and their stack up Holy Blur partner runs away. Next up is a critical hit on the tank. Cooldown and heal as necessary. Immediately after, another MINDJACK cast occurs. Players should acknowledge what direction their MINDJACK debuff will force them in and keep it in mind for the upcoming combo of mechanics. The boss will cast Place Dark Token and summon a number of Soul Reaper adds around the platform. The Soul Reaper adds in the corners will cast Gusting Gouge again and rush in a straight line. Their orientation makes every single tile on the outer edge unsafe. The center Soul Reaper add will cast a large point-blank AoE circle in the middle of the room. 4 other Soul Reaper adds will tether to 4 players. At the end of their casts, the tethered adds will deal damage to their players based on proximity. Remember that all players have to deal with MINDJACK right before all of these attacks go off. This can be pretty confusing at first glance, so let's break it down slowly. Due to the trajectories of the outer Soul Reaper adds, we know that every single outer tile is not safe. That means players only have these 4 middle tiles to work with. However, since the middle Soul Reaper add is hogging most of this area with his circle AoE, the safe zones are actually limited to the outer corners of these 4 middle tiles. There's not a lot of room to work with, but fortunately you don't need a lot. Now, if you're not tethered to an ad, you have it easy, since all you have to do during MINDJACK is position yourself to end up in a safe zone. As long as you're not sprinting, the duration of MINDJACK will take your character about the length of 2 tiles. As such, you can position yourself in one corner and then face your character in such a way that MINDJACK walks your character across to the next corner. Nice and simple. If you are a tethered player, you need to take into account the position of your Soul Reaper ad. The end goal is to end up the furthest possible distance or kitty corner from your ad. If you have a left or right MINDJACK, you can accomplish this by moving to the corner directly across from your ad and then facing your character to move to the opposite corner during MINDJACK. If you have forward or about face, you can move to your ad and then position yourself to move diagonally across the center to your safe corner. You'll have a few seconds to make some fine adjustments to your positioning once MINDJACK runs out and before the Soul Reaper attacks go out. Once these attacks are out, the boss will leap to a new tile and cast the Queen's Waltz again. Players need to quickly determine what tile she's on and then prepare to handle its respective variation of the Queen's Waltz as necessary. Healers will need to heal through another dimensional wave here. The boss will then cast Haste and 2 AoE attacks in succession. Dodge these attacks as necessary. Another dimensional wave to heal through, and then the next place token. This will spawn 1 Iron Giant in the east and 6 Ninja Adds in the west. Have one tank grab the Iron Giant while the other grabs the group of ninjas. The Iron Giant should be faced away from the raid to avoid cleaving everyone. Periodically, he will cast Overheat in an attempt to buff himself. Luckily, this can be silenced. During this time, the boss will cast Haste 3 on herself, which will give her a longer haste buff for about 33 seconds. She will then cast Dimensional Wave 4 times in a row. All players should focus down these adds as quickly as possible, using cooldowns and limit breaks as necessary. Healers will have to keep everyone topped off during this heavy raid-wide damage. Once all 4 Dimensional Wave casts have gone off, the boss will leap to a tile and cast the Queen's Waltz. Again, position yourselves appropriately based on what tile she's standing on. Next up, another Spellblade AoE to dodge, another dimensional wave to heal through, and another critical hit on the tank. Don't forget your cooldowns. Another leap to a tile, and another Queen's Waltz. Position yourself appropriately based on what variation of Queen's Waltz attack is coming. The next Spellblade Holy is the familiar markers and tethers. Handle these in the same manner as before. Another critical hit on the tank, and the next Mindjack cast will go off. The boss will cast Place Dark Token, and the Soul Reaper adds will spawn again. This Mindjack and Soul Reaper combo is handled in the same way the first one was. Position yourself accordingly to avoid the AoEs and be as far away from your ad if you're tethered. Another leap to a random tile, and another Queen's Waltz. By now, you should know exactly what to do. Shortly after, another dimensional wave to heal through, and another haste and double AoE combo. Dodge these as necessary. There is one last dimensional wave before the boss casts her final playing field and rage. Animal tiles will appear, but the boss won't give you a chance to turn into anything, and instead cast the game immediately, wiping the raid. This fight is all about practice and reacting to each mechanic quickly and efficiently. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know. Up next, we'll head into the Deltascape version 4.0 Savage. As always, thanks for watching. Till next time.